At the edge of the world, at the place where the world simply stops, there is a stone house. The air there is cool in a way that has nothing to do with wind, a stillness that seems to belong to the stone itself, to the ground underfoot, to the particular quality of the dark that gathers at this far boundary and does not thin or shift the way darkness does in the places where morning can reach. The ground is not soft. It is not the kind of place anything has grown. There is no sound of birds, no rustle of any creature moving through undergrowth, because there is no undergrowth here, no trees, no grass, no soil in which anything has taken root. There is stone, and there is the dark, and there is the house. The ancient Greek poet Hesiod, composing his account of the birth of the gods and the ordering of the cosmos, sometime in the 7th or 8th century before the Common Era, describes this place with the particular care he gives to locations where the cosmos arranges itself at its outermost edges. In his Theogony, a long formal poem whose title means simply the genealogy of the gods, he places this house near Tartarus, the deepest and most remote of all the regions the ancient Greeks mapped into the structure of the world. The house stands at a threshold, a great doorway, and at this doorway, according to what the tradition holds, night and day have always exchanged their places, one crossing in as the other crosses out, the exchange happening in perfect and wordless regularity, the way a tide moves in and then out without deliberation and without error. Two sets of footsteps, not at once, never at once, the two figures do not meet. They pass close to the great threshold from opposite sides, and for a single moment, in the threshold itself, at the exact point where outside becomes inside and inside becomes outside, they are briefly, nearly simultaneous. Then one is already moving away, and the other is already moving inward, and the exchange is complete. The door has no lock. It needs none. The pattern holds itself. This is where Nyx lives. This is where the tradition places her. Not at Olympus, not in the underworld, not in any region that the other gods could reach with certainty and comfort, but at this far edge where the world's architecture meets its own ending. She is not in the house because she is hiding. She is in the house because this is the place that was hers before the question of arrangement had even been asked. To understand what Hesiod means when he places Nyx at the beginning of his cosmological account, it helps to follow the sequence the Theogony establishes carefully, because the order matters in a way that is not incidental. The poem does not begin with Zeus. It does not begin with the Olympians, or with the Titans who came before them, or with the stories most people encounter first when they encounter Greek mythology at all. The Theogony begins earlier than all of that. It begins with the beings who were not created but simply were, the first presences from which everything else came, and Nyx is among them. Hesiod names the first beings in a small group: Chaos, Gaia, Tartarus, Eros, Erebus, and Nyx. These names do not describe gods in the sense that the Olympians are gods, figures with personalities, preferences, genealogies, domestic arrangements, and opinions about the affairs of mortals. They describe conditions, presences, things that were necessary before anything else could come into being. Chaos is the initial state, not disorder in the modern sense, but the open, undifferentiated vastness from which everything else would separate out. Gaia is the earth, understood not as a surface to stand on, but as the fundamental ground of existence. Tartarus is the deep beneath the deep, the absolute underside of the world. Eros is generative desire, the force that drives things toward one another and makes combination possible. and from chaos, or in the ancient reading, alongside the emergence of chaos itself, came Erebus and Nyx. Erebus and Nyx are twin forms of darkness. The tradition holds this distinction between them with precision. Erebus is the darkness beneath the earth, the dark through which the dead travel, the particular quality of shadow that belongs to what is underground and unseen. Nyx is the darkness of the sky above, the darkness that comes each evening across the heavens, that moves in as the light moves out, that spreads over the surface of the world and holds it until morning. Two forms of the same original condition, separated by direction, one below and one above. The way a still lake reflects the sky so exactly that for a moment it seems the sky is present twice, once overhead and once in the water below, each completing the other, each the mirror of the other's darkness. From the union of Nyx and Erebus, the tradition records came two children, Aether and Hemera. Aether, the bright upper air, the clear luminous atmosphere of the highest regions, the substance in which the gods moved when they moved above the world, and Hemera, Deipso, daylight itself, the warmth and visibility of the waking world. These are the children of darkness. Hesiod is quite specific about this order, and it is worth allowing that specificity to settle for a moment, because it runs against an assumption so ordinary it often goes unexamined. Light does not come first. In the ancient Greek account, darkness comes first. Day is the child of night. Brightness is born from the dark. The way at the horizon just before dawn, the first faint lightening of the sky, seems to grow directly out of its darkest part, not introduced from somewhere else, but produced by the darkness itself, as if the dark at its deepest had generated its own opposite. This is the logic the theogony encodes in its genealogy. Light requires darkness in order to exist. Day requires night. The order of priority is not a judgment about which is better or worse. It is a description of which came first. And in the ancient Greek account, darkness came first, and Nyx, the darkness of the sky, was present in that first moment and has never ceased to be present since. She is described in Hesiod's text as black night, Nyx Erebene in the original Greek, the adjective reinforcing the connection between her name and the darkness of Erebus, the darkness from which she and her twin both came. Later ancient sources, poets and commentators working in the centuries after Hesiod, added physical details that the theogony itself does not fully elaborate. They described her wearing robes studded with stars. They described her as possessing great black wings that she spread across the heavens each evening as she crossed in through the great door at the edge of the world and moved over the sky. The image these later sources build is one of the most quietly beautiful in all of ancient Greek religious imagination, a figure of enormous scale moving overhead each night, and what the watching world sees in the sky above, the darkness, the stars appearing one by one in the fabric of it, is the garment she is wearing. The stars in this ancient understanding are not distant suns. They are not engines of fusion burning across unimaginable gulfs of space. They are decorations in the fabric of a robe. They are carried each evening across the heavens by the figure who wears them, and every night when the sky goes dark and the first points of light begin to appear in it, what the ancient world was seeing, what the ancient mind could understand itself to be seeing, was the hem of Nyx's garment crossing the horizon. First one star, then another, then the long scatter of them across the middle of the sky, the thick bright path of them that later astronomers would call by different names, visible only after full dark, only after the eye has adjusted enough to the depth of the night to see what has always been there, to have that kind of understanding of what the night sky is, to look up at it, not as emptiness or cold distance, but as the robe of an ancient figure moving across the world in the regular performance of her oldest function, is to be in a very different relationship with darkness than the modern one. The dark becomes something worn, something inhabited, something that has been moving across the same sky for as long as there has been a sky to move across. At the great threshold, at the doorway in the stone house at the edge of the world, this movement is organized. The tradition holds that Nyx and her daughter Hemera, Day, share the space of the threshold between them, but do not share it at the same moment. The exchange described in Hesiod's Theogony has a quality of perfect mechanical precision. Day departs, crossing out through the doorway into the world, and as she goes, night arrives, crossing in. The interval between their departures is exactly the length of a day. The interval between their arrivals is exactly the length of a night. The mechanism does not slip. It has not slipped since the first exchange. It will not slip while anything in the cosmos continues to have a shape. There is something restful about a mechanism that does not slip. Something that has been reliable for longer than any human institution or memory or record, longer than the Theogony itself, which is already more than 2,500 years old, which was itself describing something understood to be older than time, as mortals measure it. The exchange of night and day at the threshold preceded the Trojan War. It preceded the first Olympians. It preceded the Titans. It was already old in the accounting of the Theogony when Kronos first swallowed his children. It was already functioning when the world was formed from the bodies of earlier beings, or separated out from earlier conditions, or spoke itself into existence, whatever creation account one follows. The exchange of night and day at the edge of the cosmos was already there, because night was already there, because night was among the first. The stone house at the edge of the world is a specific place in a specific cosmological geography. The Theogony maps this geography with some care. Tartarus is described as lying at a distance from the Earth's surface, equal to the distance between the Earth's surface and the sky, an enormous interval, a number that staggers the imagination, even in the ancient context. The region near Tartarus, where Nyx dwells, is at the absolute extreme of what can be said to exist. It is the place that is furthest from the center of the world. No journey goes past it. No road leads beyond it. It is the place where the architecture of the cosmos meets its own outer limit and simply stops, the way a sentence stops at its final word, and after that there is nothing but the silence in which it has been spoken. The hinge of the door in the stone house is what the ancient imagination placed at that outermost point, a threshold between two vast rooms, the room that is the sky, the waking world, the realm of light and divine action and mortal life, and the room that is Tartarus, the deep beneath the deep, the place of absolute enclosure, and at the exact junction of these two rooms, where the hinge of a door would be, is where Nyx lives. Not in either room, at the point where they meet. This positioning tells something important about what the ancient Greek theological imagination understood Nyx to be. She is not a goddess of the underworld, though she lives near its deepest region. She is not a goddess of the sky, though the darkness she embodies is the darkness of the sky above. She is the thing that makes the transition between states possible, the condition under which one thing becomes another, the darkness in which the transformation between day and night occurs. She is not the light. She is not the deep. She is the movement between them, as regular and as old as the world itself. Hesiod composed his Theogony at a moment in the history of Greek religious thought, when the older layers of cosmological understanding were still visible, when the beings who preceded the Olympians had not yet been entirely subsumed into the later, more familiar narrative of Zeus's ascendancy and the establishment of the Olympian order. The theogony preserves both layers. It contains the story of Zeus's victory over the Titans, the establishment of his authority, the distribution of honors and domains among the gods. But it also contains, in its earlier passages, the record of what existed before all of that, the beings who did not need to win anything in order to have their position, because their position was identical with the world's own conditions of existence. Nyx is the clearest example of this earlier layer. Her position in the theogony is not the result of any victory. It is not the result of any lineage that connects her to Zeus or places her within his order. She does not appear in any story of divine struggle or succession. She simply appears in the first generation of beings among the things that were, and then the world proceeds from that beginning, with her still present, still at the threshold, still performing the exchange with day, at the doorway of the stone house, at the edge of everything. The ancient world developed many images for what Nyx looks like as she moves across the sky each evening, and it is worth dwelling on these images because they are careful and considered, not decorative additions to the mythology, but attempts by later poets and commentators to give visible form to something that is, by definition, not quite visible. You cannot look at darkness the way you can look at a figure standing in the light. Darkness is the condition under which looking itself changes. The robes with their embedded stars are an answer to this problem. They give Nyx a visible form by describing what the visible world actually shows, and proposing that what is shown is the evidence of her presence. The robes move across the sky. The stars come with them. The stars do not remain stationary, or rather, they appear stationary against the darkness, but the darkness itself moves, and so the stars move with it, tracing their long arcs across the heavens from east to west over the course of each night, maintaining their positions relative to one another, even as the whole fabric they are embedded in turns. This was understood in ancient Greek astronomy as a real phenomenon requiring an explanation, and the explanation the theological imagination offered was this: the rotation of the night sky is the movement of the figure who wears it. The wings that later sources add to Nyx's description serve a different visual purpose. Wings are the attribute of speed and of crossing between domains, of movement that is not restricted to the surface of the ground, that can cover vast distances in a way that walking cannot. The gods of ancient Greece and many other traditions are frequently winged for exactly this reason. They need to be able to move between the human world and the divine one, between the surface of the earth and the sky, between the present moment and the distant past or future. Nyx's wings, spread across the heavens as she crosses in through the doorway, cover the distance from the edge of the world to its center, an enormous distance, the full width of the sky above, in the time it takes for the light to go and the dark to replace it. This is not a leisurely crossing, and yet it never seems hurried. The transition is never abrupt. Night does not fall so much as it arrives, and the image of wings describes the arrival, something crossing the full width of the sky without landing, the shadow of the wings preceding the figure, by enough time that what the world below experiences is a gradual change, a softening of the light at the horizon, a deepening of the blue overhead before the black begins. The deepening is the edge of the wing, the full dark is the body of the figure, and in the full dark, sewn into the fabric of the robe, the stars appear. In the time of Hesiod's composition, the theogony was not a text read silently by individuals in private rooms. It was composed in and for a performative context, sung or recited in the tradition of the epic verse that also produced the Iliad and Odyssey, in the hexameter lines that the ancient Greek ear found natural and memorable at public gatherings and religious festivals, and in the households of those wealthy enough to host a performer. To hear the theogony was to follow a cosmological account from the first moment, from chaos and the beings who emerged from it, through the succession of divine generations to the present order of the world. And in that progression, Nyx appears near the beginning, in the first generation, before the structure of divine society had been organized into the form that would become familiar. The listener who followed the theogony from its opening lines was being shown, among other things, how old the world was, and that oldness was made concrete through the catalog of beings who existed before the Olympians, each of them not a character in a story, but a presence whose existence was a structural feature of the world itself. Nyx is darkness, not a goddess who happens to be associated with darkness, or who rules over darkness as a domain she was given when the domains were distributed among the gods. She is the thing itself. The darkness of the night sky is not a phenomenon that Nyx governs from a distance. It is what she is, as she moves across the heavens in her dark robe with its scatter of stars, as she passes through the doorway at the edge of the world, and the threshold exchanges its occupant without sound. For the ancient Greeks who understood the cosmos through the theogony's account, the nightly return of darkness was not a neutral event, not simply the rotation of the earth catching up with its shadow. It was the return of something, the arrival of something that had been at the edge of the world since the beginning, something performing its exchange with day at the great threshold, crossing through the doorway, spreading across the sky in its black-winged, star-studded robe, settling into the space that day has just left. The same space, the same sky, the same world, but now occupied by its oldest and most original condition. The stone house at the edge of the world persists in the imagination, even when the eye cannot find it. It is in the direction of whatever is most far, in the direction of whatever the mind approaches when it tries to imagine what exists past the known boundary of things. Not a frightening location, not a place associated with punishment or exile or catastrophe, but a place whose distance from ordinary life is itself its defining characteristic. Nothing that would be out of place at the center of the world has any reason to be there. It is where you go, in the logic of the myth, when you belong to the original condition rather than to the ordered world that the original condition made possible. Nyx belongs there because she was the condition. She was part of what darkness is before any particular night, before any particular instance of the sky going dark in any particular place. She is the general principle of which every evening is a specific application, and at the threshold of the stone house, where the exchange with day happens in its perfect and ancient regularity, the principle performs its function as it has performed it since the function was first needed, since the sky first had a darkness to possess, since the world first arranged itself into a day and a night that had to be exchanged. The image is worth holding for a moment. Two figures at a threshold, never meeting, each the condition that makes the other possible, their exchange as regular and wordless as breathing. Day going out, night coming in, the door between them, the precise length of an instant. The stone house at the edge of everything, cool and still, at the junction of the world's outermost edge and the deep beneath it, with no sound entering from anywhere, because there is no anywhere beyond it where sound could originate. And then the exchange completes, and night crosses the threshold and begins the long movement across the sky and far away from the stone house, over the surface of the world, over the ocean that circles its edges, over the mountains and the plains and the cities of the mortals who live in the middle of everything. The light begins to go, first at the edges, where the sky meets the horizon, then higher, moving toward the center of the sky, the blue deepening, the first colors draining out of the world, the way color always drains at the end of the day, replaced by the longer light that comes before dark. Then the first stars. The first star that appears when the sky begins to darken is the brightest, the one whose light is strong enough to penetrate the thin early dark before the full depth of night has arrived. And then, as the dark deepens, the others follow, gradually at first, then quickly, then all at once, the full scatter of them appearing in the sky, as if they had always been there, and it only required enough darkness to make them visible, which is of course exactly true. They were always there. The daylight conceals them. The dark reveals them, not by putting anything new in the sky, but by taking away the light that made them invisible. In the understanding the theogony encodes, these stars are part of the robe. They were always part of the robe. They travel with Nyx because they belong to her garment, and when the garment is overhead, they are overhead, and when the garment moves on, they move with it. The sky at night is not empty, it is occupied, and what occupies it is something that was present in the first generation of everything that exists, something that has been performing this same movement across this same sky since before there was a human eye to look up at it and see what was there. There is something in this understanding, this way of seeing the night sky as the robe of a being older than the ordered world, that makes the ordinary act of looking up at the dark overhead feel different, not alarming, not overwhelming, something in the direction of being a witness to something very old, the particular feeling of being in the presence of something that was not made and cannot be unmade. The mountains have it in certain lights, the ocean has it. The ancient Greeks located it in the sky above, in the thing that the sky does each evening when it darkens and fills with stars. And they gave that thing a name. The name is Nyx, the darkness of the sky, one of the first, present before the Olympians, present before the Titans, present in the original generation that emerged from or alongside the initial condition of the cosmos, living at the edge of the world in a stone house near Tartarus, and was now performing her exchange with day at the great threshold, without variation and without end, wearing her dark robe with its stars sewn into the fabric, crossing the full width of the sky each evening on her great wings, arriving as she has always arrived. As the light withdraws to wherever the light goes, when the darkness comes to take its place, the sky goes dark in stages, the horizon first, then the space above the horizon, then the middle distance of the sky overhead, where the color lingers longest before it gives way, and finally the deepest blue, just before full dark, the particular shade of near black that the sky reaches at its zenith just before the stars are numerous enough to be called a sky full of stars, rather than a sky with a few stars in it. At that moment, at the moment before the sky is fully dark, when the last of the blue is still present at the zenith and the stars are just beginning to populate the dark around it, the ancient world understood something very particular to be happening, not the day ending, not the sun setting, not the earth rotating away from the light, but a figure crossing the threshold, a great door at the edge of the world, one set of footsteps growing faint, another growing present, the exchange completing, and then the darkness coming fully, the way Nyx's robe extends to cover the whole of the sky that is hers to cover, the last of the blue, replaced by the full dark of her passing, and the stars appearing in the fabric of it, first one, then another, then the long, slow population of the whole visible sky, each star settling into its place in the pattern of the robe, carrying across the heavens the same light it has always carried, in the same position it has always occupied, as regular and as old as the exchange at the stone house that set the whole movement in motion. The Theogony describes this. It describes it in the particular way an ancient poem describes anything, not with photographs or measurements, but with the precision of cosmological understanding, translated into images that the human mind can follow: a house, a threshold, a figure with wings, a robe with stars in it, an exchange performed at the edge of the world. The images are not naive, they are considered. They are the result of a tradition, thinking carefully about what it meant for darkness to be an original condition of existence, older than light, older than the organized world, present in the first generation of everything that is. And at the close of each day, when the first star appears in the sky overhead, that tradition's answer moves quietly into place. The dark fabric extending from the horizon upward, the stars appearing in it one by one, the way something sewn into cloth appears as the cloth is unfolded, the familiar scatter of them overhead, each in its ancient position, carried as they have been carried since the first evening, in the robe of the oldest of the night's presences, arriving as she has always arrived, settling into the sky as if settling were the simplest and most natural thing in the world, which in the ancient account it is. Hypnos was already moving when the fear reached him, not the slow, considered retreat of someone weighing their options, but the instinctive, immediate flight of a figure who knows exactly what is behind him and exactly where safety lies. The winged god of sleep crossed the sky in the direction every creature with any knowledge of the old order would cross it, toward the western edge of the world, away from Olympus, away from the gathering anger of Zeus, toward the one domain in all of existence that the king of the gods would not follow him into. What Hypnos had just done was not a small thing. At the request of Hera, he had put Zeus to sleep. He had drawn the heaviest divine consciousness in the Greek cosmos down into unconsciousness, quietly, skillfully, the way his nature always operated, without announcement, without struggle, without the kind of confrontation that leaves marks. And then the sleep had worn off, and Zeus had understood what had been done to him, and Hypnos had understood that understanding, and he had gone. Homer preserves the account in the 14th book of the Iliad. It is told not as narrative in the moment, but as Hypnos himself recounting it, which gives the episode a particular quality, the quality of something already survived, something that is already resolved in the teller's favor, a story being related from the safety of its own conclusion. Hypnos is speaking to Hera when he tells it. She has come to find him again, with another request, and he is reminding her what the last one cost him, or what it nearly cost him, before a threshold intervened that no one crosses. The specific details of what Hera needed from him in that earlier instance are worth holding for a moment, because they are what the rest of the episode depends upon. Hera wanted Zeus incapacitated, not permanently, that was never the design, but long enough for Poseidon to move freely among the Greek ships at Troy, lending his support to the Greeks without Zeus watching and objecting and issuing the kind of commands that Poseidon, as a fellow senior Olympian, would have had difficulty simply ignoring. Zeus had decreed a particular position. The Greeks were to suffer reverses at Troy for a time, in honor of a promise he had made. Hera found this arrangement unsatisfactory. She could not countermand the decree. She could not argue Zeus out of it. What she could do was arrange for him to be, for a period, unaware that anything was happening at all. Hypnos had been reluctant. The account preserves that reluctance directly, preserves the specific shape of his hesitation. He had done this once before, put Zeus to sleep at Hera's request. And when Zeus had woken, he had been furious and had gone looking for Hypnos with the full force of his displeasure, directed at a single small winged figure who had, by the nature of his power, nowhere obvious to hide. The first time, as Hypnos tells it, he had fled to night. He had gone to where his mother dwelt, at the far boundary of the world, and there he had been safe. Zeus had come to the edge of that boundary, and then Zeus had stopped. That is the moment worth staying with. Not the flight itself, not the fear, not the anger of Zeus, but the stopping, the point at which the pursuit simply ceased. Homer's text is specific about this. Zeus stopped, and the reason Homer gives is direct. He did not wish to do anything displeasing to swift night. The phrasing in the original Greek has been noted by translators across centuries for its candor, for the way it does not hedge or elaborate. It does not say that Zeus calculated the risks. It does not say that he chose strategic restraint. It says, he did not wish to displease her. The restraint is not political. It is not a matter of military disadvantage or divine alliance. It is something closer to the way a very powerful figure might stop at the edge of something older than their power and find that even they do not want to disturb it. The scholiasts, ancient commentators, who annotated Homer's text in the margins of manuscripts, whose work has survived alongside the Iliad through the long history of that text transmission, return to this passage with visible interest. Their notes on these lines are preserved, fragmentary in places but readable, and they treat the episode not as a narrative curiosity, but as a theologically significant moment. For the ancient scholar sitting with the Iliad, line by line, this was a passage that required attention, that asked for an explanation. Why would Zeus stop? What did it mean that night held this authority? The scholiasts ask these questions in the margins, in the careful small handwriting of people who had thought about the text long enough that even its most apparently settled moments still had questions inside them. Nyx herself does nothing in the episode. That is one of the things that makes the account remarkable. She does not appear, she does not speak, she does not issue any prohibition or warning or demand. The sanctuary she provides to Hypnos is not the result of an action she takes, it is simply what her domain is. The protection is not something she extends, it is something that exists, the way the depth of very cold water exists without the water deciding to be deep. Hypnos runs toward her the way water runs toward the lowest point, not because she calls him, but because the shape of the world's authority makes her dwelling the only destination that makes sense. What the episode locates in the specific geography of Greek divine order is a threshold. Between the domain of Nyx and the domain of Zeus, there is a boundary, and the boundary is not contested or negotiated or maintained by any treaty. It simply exists as the older order. Zeus is the ruler of the gods of Olympus, the third generation of divine rulers in the Greek tradition, the culmination of a succession that moved through Uranus and Cronus before arriving at the Olympian arrangement that classical Greek religion most often describes. His authority is immense. Within the cosmological world the myths describe, it is effectively the highest authority available to any figure operating within the current arrangement of things. And it stops at a particular edge, and the figure on the other side of that edge is Nyx, who is not part of that arrangement, because she was already there when the arrangement did not yet exist. Hera knows this. The logic of her plan depends on it. When she goes to Hypnos with her request, she does not offer him divine protection. does not promise him the shelter of Olympus or the defense of any particular god. She offers him something else, according to the account, a throne of gold and a footstool to go with it, gifts of the kind that acknowledge what cannot simply be commanded. But the fact underlying the negotiation is that Hypnos already has a sanctuary, has already used it once, and knows it holds. Hera's request is possible partly because Hypnos has already demonstrated to himself that the place his mother dwells will protect him from the consequences of exactly this kind of action. He has already run tonight. He already knows where the edge of Zeus's pursuit lies. The Neoplatonist philosopher Proclus, writing in the 5th century CE, long after the Homeric poems had become the foundational texts of a literary tradition, rather than living oral poetry, returned to this episode in his commentary on Plato's Republic. Proclus was interested in the theological structure of Greek myth, in the ways that narrative could encode philosophical and cosmological truths about the nature of divine reality. And the Iliad passage about Nyx was for him exactly the kind of episode that repaid this kind of attention. He read Zeus's restraint not as a narrative convenience, not as Homer simply constructing a plot that required Hypnos to survive, but as a preserved theological claim about the actual structure of divine reality, the primordial power's genuine preeminence over the Olympian order. For Proclus, the passage was evidence that Greek theology, at its oldest and most fundamental level, recognized a stratum of divine authority that preceded and superseded the Olympian arrangement. The Olympian gods were not the original powers. They were the current arrangement, the cosmological government that had come into being through a succession of contests and displacements, Uranus giving way to Cronus, Cronus giving way to Zeus. But behind all of that succession, beneath all of it, were powers that had never been displaced because they had never been part of a succession. They had simply been there. Nyx was one of those powers, and the evidence Proclus cited for this reading was precisely the moment in the Iliad when the most powerful figure of the current divine order arrived at her boundary and turned back. Proclus was not alone in reading the passage this way. The tradition of ancient commentary on Homer is long and varied, and the scholiasts and later mythographers who engaged with these lines did so across many centuries, treating the episode as a recognized feature of the theological landscape rather than a minor narrative detail. The mythographer Apollodorus, whose Bibliotheca, a systematic account of Greek myth assembled sometime around the 1st or 2nd century CE, preserved and elaborated upon various traditions surrounding the primordial gods, worked within a world in which this episode was already well established as part of the documented mythology, not as a novelty requiring special defense, but as something that had been recognized for long enough that its edges had worn smooth. What the ancient commentators understood, and what the accumulated weight of those commentaries preserves, is that Nyx's authority in this episode is not borrowed from any relationship or alliance. It does not derive from a powerful consort, or a particularly impressive set of offspring, or a history of successful conflict with the Olympian powers. It derives from what she is, which is older than the current order of things. The word the tradition uses, primordial, carries a specific meaning here. It does not mean very old, in the way that a building might be very old, still standing, but displaced by newer and larger structures around it. It means present at a level of reality that the later structures are built upon, whose existence is a condition for the existence of everything that came afterward. The Greeks who transmitted and elaborated the mythology of their tradition were not naive about cosmological succession. They knew the story of how the Olympians had come to power. They knew the story of the Titans, of Uranus, of the long and violent process by which the current divine arrangement had come to be. What the survival of Nyx's authority in this episode reflects is the recognition that some things were not part of that succession because they could not be, because they were not rival powers to be displaced, but conditions of existence itself. Night was not a power that Zeus could overthrow and replace with something else. Night was not something Zeus could claim authority over the way he claimed authority over weather, over divine counsel, over the fate of the war at Troy. Night simply was and had been, and Zeus had been born into a world where night was already one of the permanent features. The parallel that the ancient world sometimes drew, and that Proclus makes explicit in his commentary, is between Nyx and the Fates. The tradition also records that Zeus deferred to the Moirai, the three sisters who measured and apportioned the lives of mortals, in ways that suggested their authority operated outside the range of his power. The connection is not accidental. Both the Fates and Night belong to the oldest layer of the Greek theological world. Both represent not things that happen within the cosmos, but structures that the cosmos runs on. And in both cases, the tradition preserves the recognition that Zeus's enormous practical authority, his lightning, his sovereignty over the divine assembly, his ability to determine the outcomes of wars, did not extend to the point of simply overriding these older structures. He worked within them the way the mightiest river still flows downhill. To return to the specific image of Hypnos in flight is to notice something about the shape of the divine world the myth describes. Hypnos does not fly toward Olympus. He does not seek out Hera, who set him his task. He does not appeal to any of the other senior Olympians for protection or intercession. He flies to his mother. The choice is automatic, the direction immediately known, the destination understood without deliberation. And what that automatic knowledge reflects is a genuine feature of the world the mythology describes. The fact that in that world, the oldest address of safety is the one at the western edge, in the stone house at the junction of the underworld and the sky, where night dwells, and where no one with any knowledge of the real structure of things will follow uninvited. The image of Zeus at that boundary is worth sitting with for a little while, because it is unusual in the Greek mythological record. Zeus is not often described stopping. The tradition is full of accounts of his pursuit, of gods, of mortals, of titans and monsters, and various beings who found themselves on the wrong side of his attention, and the pattern in most of those accounts is that his pursuit eventually reaches its conclusion. He is the king of the gods. His will tends to prevail within the world the myths describe. The episode with Nyx is one of the very few places in the entire Homeric corpus where the pursuit simply does not arrive at a conclusion, where Zeus reaches a point and the momentum of his power simply dissipates at the edge of something older, and the text records this without elaborate explanation, as though the fact itself requires no special defense. Ancient scholars found the episode interesting for exactly this reason. Something had to be explained about it, or at least engaged with, not because it was implausible within the mythological world, but because it was specific enough, candid enough, to demand that a reader with any theological interest stop and think about what was actually being claimed. The scholiasts stopping to annotate these lines were doing what attentive readers of a complex theological document do. They were sitting with a detail that resisted easy summary, that opened into the deeper structural questions of how the Greek divine world was actually organized beneath the surface of the narrative. What those annotations preserve, across centuries of copying and transmission, is the understanding that the episode was real, in the sense that mythological episodes are real, not as historical event, but as theological claim, as a piece of encoded cosmological information about the actual relationship between the primordial powers and the Olympian order. The scholars who returned to it across generations were not correcting an error or explaining an anomaly. They were documenting a recognized and significant feature of the theological world they had inherited. The account that Hypnos gives Hera, in which he tells her what happened the first time he worked for her, has a particular texture. It is the account of someone who has already been through something and survived it, who knows where safety lies because they have already run to it once and found that it held. The fear he describes is real within the narrative. The flight, the terror of Zeus's waking anger, the urgent cross-sky movement toward the edge of the world, but all of it has already resolved by the time he speaks. He is alive. He is sitting somewhere, telling a goddess what he once did and where he went when it went wrong. The account exists in the past tense of the narrative, which means it also exists in the comfortable past tense of something that was survived, something that did not in the end destroy the one it threatened. That survival depends on one thing, the fact that Night's domain was inviolable, not defended, not fortified, not protected by any arrangement of guards or weapons or divine allies who might have been overcome by a sufficiently determined Olympian. Simply inviolable in the deeper sense, the sense in which certain things are outside the range of certain kinds of power, not because anyone enforced a limit, but because the structure of reality placed one there. The word that Homer uses, in the lines that describe Zeus stopping, the word usually translated as something like displeasing or offensive, carries a particular weight. It implies not just inconvenience or political consequence, but something closer to the violation of a proper order. Zeus stopped not because he calculated that the cost of continuing outweighed the benefit, but because to continue would have been to do something wrong in a way that transcended politics. It would have been to violate a domain that was older than his authority, to push past a boundary that the structure of the world had placed there before he existed. The restraint is not strategic. It is, in the specific language of the tradition, a matter of what is right, which in the Greek theological world is a concept that even the king of the gods cannot simply override by willing it otherwise. The flight of Hypnos and the stopping of Zeus together describe the shape of something. They describe the outermost limit of the Olympian order, not its political edge, not the boundary of Zeus's practical influence, but the point where the world that Zeus governs gives way to the world that was there before him and will be there regardless of him. And at that point, at that precise boundary, what the myth finds is not a rival power or a contested frontier. What it finds is a goddess dwelling quietly in her stone house at the edge of everything, whose authority does not require demonstration because it is simply part of the fabric of what exists. Hypnos reaches that boundary and crosses it. Zeus reaches it and does not cross. The difference between those two outcomes is the whole content of the episode, the reason the ancient scholiasts found it worth annotating, the reason Proclus returned to it as a theological cornerstone, the reason it has survived in the record, not as a minor detail, but as a passage that has been thought about, written about, and preserved as something genuinely worth thinking about across more than 2.5 millennia of engagement with the Homeric text. What it preserves is not a story about conflict. There is no conflict in this episode. There is a flight, there is a pursuit, and there is a stopping, and the stopping is total, and the reason for it is stated plainly, and that plainness is what makes the episode so quietly significant within the larger tradition. Homer does not dramatize Zeus's restraint. He simply records it in the way one records a feature of the landscape, a river that does not flow past a certain point, a road that ends where the ground runs out. The restraint is described with the same matter-of-fact quality as any other feature of the mythological world. Zeus stopped. He did not wish to displease Night. That is the whole account, and in its brevity, in its refusal to elaborate or explain, it implies that the stopping required no explanation because the reason was simply obvious to anyone who understood how the world was actually organized. The stone house at the edge of the cosmos, where night dwells at the junction of underworld and sky, it appears in Hesiod's Theogony as a specific place described with geographical precision within the mythological landscape, a place with real coordinates in the ancient Greek understanding of how the world was laid out. It is not a vague or symbolic location. It has a doorway that Night uses when she goes out into the world each evening, and it has the threshold that Day crosses coming the other way, and the two of them pass each other at that threshold without meeting, the departing one always already gone when the arriving one steps through. Hypnos lives near this house. His cave is in the same neighborhood, in the same remote western region of the mythological world, and this proximity to his mother's dwelling is part of what makes the flight instinctive and the sanctuary immediate. He runs toward his mother's house the way any figure in danger runs toward the place they know holds. And Zeus stops at the boundary of that house. The most powerful figure in the current divine order, with all of his practical authority and all of his lightning and all of the accumulated weight of a sovereignty established through a succession of cosmic contests, he stops, not because Night threatens him, not because she appears at the doorway and commands him to halt, not because there is any visible enforcement of the boundary. He stops because the boundary is real in the deepest sense available to the mythological world, and he knows it, and the tradition records his knowing it in a single line that has been copied, annotated, translated, and returned to across more generations than it is easy to hold in mind at once. That pause, the pause itself, Zeus standing at the boundary and going no further, is perhaps the single clearest image the Greek tradition preserves of what it means for something to be genuinely old. Not old in the sense of existing for a long time, though Nyx is that too. Old in the sense that her existence precedes the kind of authority that Zeus represents, that she is there before the category of divine king existed as a concept, that the world she inhabits and that inhabits her is not a world organized around his power, but a world within which his power eventually appeared, as one feature among others, younger than the darkness that was there before it. The boundary holds, the pursuit ends, Hypnos remains where he ran to, and the tradition, having recorded all of this with the calm specificity of someone documenting a known feature of the theological landscape, moves on to other things, leaving that image behind it like a stone at the edge of a road, permanent and unremarked, the kind of thing that has been there long enough that travelers have stopped needing to explain it and simply know to go no further. What the ancient commentators understood, sitting with their manuscripts in the centuries after Homer composed or assembled these lines, is that the episode was not an interruption in the story of Zeus's authority. It was a clarification of it. The authority of Zeus, immense as it was within the world the Olympian mythology describes, was always an authority exercised within a world already shaped by older powers. The stopping at the boundary of Night's domain was not a defeat and not a compromise. It was a recognition, the king of the gods recognizing, at a particular edge in the particular mythology of a particular ancient tradition, the shape of what came before him and what he moved within, the same way any ruler moves within a landscape that was there before the rule began and will be there after it ends. The Iliad goes on. The war at Troy continues. Poseidon has moved among the Greek ships in the interval, and whatever he has done there has already been done by the time Zeus wakes and understands the scope of what happened while he was unconscious. The episode resolves as episodes in the Iliad tend to resolve, not with a clear conclusion, but with the story absorbing what happened and continuing forward. The flight of Hypnos becomes past tense. The pursuit of Zeus becomes past tense. Everything becomes part of the accumulated fabric of what has already occurred, layered into the long, complex narrative of a war that has been going on for years and will go on for more. But the stopping stays. The moment at the boundary of Nyx's domain stays. In the record of the tradition, in the manuscript copies that carried the Iliad forward from its composition through the ancient world and into the medieval period, and from there into the modern one, in the scholiast's marginal notes and Proclus's philosophical commentary, and the accumulated weight of all the ancient attention paid to this single episode, the stopping stays fixed. The image of Zeus at the edge of Night's domain, turning back, not because he has been defeated, but because what lies beyond that edge is older than his power, and he knows it. That image stays exactly where Homer placed it, at the edge of the world, at the border of the oldest domain in the Greek cosmological tradition, and permanent in the record, the way certain things are permanent, simply by virtue of having been written down in a text that people have never stopped reading. The boundary of Night's domain is still in the text. It has been there, in manuscript after manuscript, copied hand to hand across the long distance between the ancient world and the present one. And in that text, Zeus still stops at it, and the reason he stops is still the same reason it has always been. He did not wish to do anything displeasing to swift Night, to the one whose house stands at the edge of everything, at the point where the world runs out and only the dark remains. At the entrance to the cave, poppies grow. They have always grown there, in the way that certain things exist in mythological space, not because they were planted, but because they belong, the flower and the place requiring one another, each one completing what the other means. The stems are thick and close together, and the blooms hang slightly, the way poppies do, as though the weight of their own color is almost more than they can carry. Beyond them, the opening in the rock is not dramatic. It is simply a threshold, dark on the other side, the way all thresholds are dark on the other side, before the eye adjusts. From within comes the sound of water, not rushing water, not the sound of a current with somewhere urgent to be, but the particular sound of water that moves slowly, as though it too is half asleep. This is the cave of Hypnos, god of sleep, and the river running nearby is the Lethe, whose waters carry forgetting the way. Ordinary rivers carry sediment, always and without preference, simply because that is what they do. The ancient sources are specific about the quality of the silence inside. It is not merely quiet, the noise of the waking world, the particular noise that ordinary life makes, the sound of people moving through their days, of birds and wind, and the constant low hum of things in motion, cannot find its way into this cave. The rock of the walls absorbs it. The poppies at the entrance deflect it. The Lethe carries it away, the way the river carries everything else. What remains inside is a silence of a different kind from ordinary silence, something that has been there long enough to have its own weight, its own texture, the way very old buildings acquire a kind of stillness that new buildings do not possess. It is the silence that exists inside night, in the particular hours when even the nocturnal world has settled. This is Hypnos's house, and he was born to it. His mother is Nyx, night herself, one of the oldest powers in the Greek understanding of what the world is made of, and he carries in his nature something of what she is, not darkness as an absence of light, but darkness as a condition of its own, complete with its own properties and its own authority. Hypnos appears in Homer's Iliad as a figure capable of something no Olympian god, not even the most powerful, would attempt without considerable thought. He can put Zeus to sleep. He does this at Hera's request, and he does it successfully, which says something about the kind of power he holds, the kind that does not require force, that does not work through confrontation, that simply applies itself to the sleeping mind and is not refused. The ancient tradition describes him as winged, as his mother is winged, able to move between worlds, between waking and sleeping, between the cave near the Lethe and whatever battlefield or bedroom or throne room requires his attention. In vase paintings from classical Athens, he appears as a young man, almost always alongside his twin brother, the two of them nearly indistinguishable in feature and form, distinguished only by what they carry and where the torch is pointing. That twin brother is Thanatos, god of a death that comes quietly. Hesiod names him in the Theogony, alongside his brother as a son of Nyx, or rather in the tradition as Hesiod preserves it, one of the many children Neat bore alone, without a father, as though these particular forces required only her to bring them into existence. The line Hesiod writes is direct. Thanatos has a heart of iron. This is not said as a condemnation. It is said the way one describes a characteristic property, the way iron is described as iron, dense and cold, and unyielding by its nature, not by choice. He does not hate the life he ends. He simply does what he does with the same regularity that his brother brings sleep to those who sleep, and that his mother brings night to the world. What Thanatos represents in the Greek understanding is not violent death, not sudden death, not the deaths that come as punishment or disaster. Those belong to different figures entirely. What he carries is the gentle, inevitable end, the death that comes when a life has simply reached the place where life ends, the way a road reaches its last mile without any particular event marking it as different from the miles before. On certain Attic vase paintings from the 5th century BCE, Thanatos and Hypnos appear together, the two of them carrying a figure between them, a mortal hero, sometimes identified as Sarpedon, the son of Zeus who dies at Troy, carried from the battlefield to his burial place by the twin brothers of sleep and peaceful death. In these paintings, both Hypnos and Thanatos are young winged and nearly identical. The only clear visual distinction is the torch that Thanatos carries, which points downward, its flame aimed at the earth. This is not a detail added for effect. It is a deliberate choice in the iconographic tradition, a way of saying something about direction, about where the two brothers are each going when they leave the world of the living. Hypnos will return. Thanatos goes in only one direction. But the face of the figure carrying the torch is calm, and the mortal in his arms does not appear to be struggling. This is what the tradition means when it distinguishes Thanatos from the Caries, from the violent death spirits. Thanatos is not something that happens to you against your nature. He is something that was always part of what you were, patient in the way that night is patient, present from the beginning. The one array, the dream spirits, the children of Nyx who move through sleeping minds, are more numerous than any single name can carry. But one name comes forward more clearly than the rest, preserved in the ancient sources with enough detail to take on something like a character. Morpheus, the most prominent of the dream spirits, holds a specific ability that separates him from his siblings. He can take human form inside a dream. not the approximate shape of a person, not a form that seems human while remaining slightly wrong, the way figures in ordinary dreams shift and blur at the edges. He can appear as a specific person, as a husband, as a king, as a soldier, as whichever mortal it is necessary to resemble in order to deliver the message the dream carries. Inside the sleeping mind, he looks exactly like someone the dreamer knows, and speaks with that person's voice, and carries the dream's meaning in the way one human being might carry a message to another. This is the role he performs in Homer's Iliad, in the passage where a dream is sent to King Agamemnon at Troy. In the dream, the god takes the form of the aged counselor Nestor, because Agamemnon trusts Nestor, because the shape Morpheus chooses is always the shape that will be believed. The message the dream carries is false. It tells Agamemnon that Zeus has promised him victory, when no such promise has been made, but the form of the communication is entirely real. Morpheus appears as a figure the king recognizes, speaks as that figure would speak, and delivers the content of the vision with the full authority of a trusted voice. The king wakes convinced. He acts on what the dream told him. What happens to the Greek armies as a result is a matter of what follows from believing a false thing in a waking world. But the mechanics of the vision itself, the specific way Morpheus moves inside the sleeping mind, and the particular care he takes with the form he chooses, these details the tradition preserves with care, because they say something about what dreams are understood to be, not random productions of a resting mind, but communications, arrivals, things that cross from one world into another through the medium of sleep. Morpheus's brothers manage different territories of the dream world. Phobator, sometimes called Icelus in the Latin tradition, that would later inherit and translate these figures, takes the forms of animals inside dreams. He is the brother who appears as the threatening creature, the beast at the edge of the dream landscape that the dreamer cannot quite outrun. Phantasos takes the forms of inanimate things. He is the mountains in dreams, the strange and shifting architecture, the objects that behave in ways objects do not behave, the ground that is not the ground. Between the three brothers, the entire range of dream experience in the ancient Greek understanding is distributed: the human presence, the animal presence, the world itself transformed and strange. All three are sons of the cave and the poppies and the slow river, sent out from the household of night into the sleeping minds of the world. The ancient tradition does not fully distinguish between prophetic dreams and ordinary ones at the level of who sends them. What Morpheus and his brothers deliver can be meaningless. It can also be the clearest sight of a true thing that any mortal will ever receive. Homer's Iliad preserves this ambiguity deliberately in a passage that has been discussed and argued over for more than 2 millennia. The image of 2 gates of dream, one made of ivory and one of horn, through which different kinds of dreams emerge. Those that come through the gate of carved ivory are the ones that deceive, beautiful, convincing, and wrong. Those that come through the gate of polished horn are the true ones, rougher, perhaps less perfect in their surface, but honest. The distinction between the gates is, in the original Greek, a pun. Ivory, elepleios, is linked to elephiromai, to deceive. Horn, charis, is linked to krino, to accomplish, to fulfill. The ancient audience who heard this passage would have heard the wordplay, would have understood that the categories of true and false dreaming are built into the names of the materials, that the gates are labeled in a language only those who know Greek can fully read. And all of this comes from the household of Nyx, from the cave near the Lethe, from the children she sent into the sleeping world. Among the daughters of night, There is one whose function is so woven into the structure of human and divine affairs that the ancient Greeks built her a temple, gave her a festival, and brought her real offerings in the hope of remaining within her attention in the right way. Nemesis, a name the Greek tradition derived from the verb nemenin, to distribute, to allot, is the goddess of retribution, and her role in the ancient understanding is both precise and wide. She is not simply punishment, she is not simply revenge. What she represents is something more structural, the force that corrects imbalance, that responds to unearned excess, that prevents any single mortal from accumulating so much good fortune, so much pride, so much of what the gods have allotted to the human condition, that the distribution of things in the world becomes fundamentally wrong. This is why Hesiod names her in the Theogony as a daughter of Nyx, and why her placement in Night's household matters. She is not an Olympian function, not something Zeus administers or Athena enforces. She is older than that, a corrective force that operates on the scale of the cosmos itself, not on the scale of divine politics. The Temple of Nemesis at Rhamnus in Attica was a real building. It still stands in partial form on a headland overlooking the sea in northeastern Attica, a real location, a real structure, visited by real people who made their way there with real intentions. The temple was attributed to the school of Phidias, the sculptor most famous for the colossal statue of Athena inside the Parthenon, which gives some sense of the seriousness with which Nemesis was worshipped in the classical period. The cult at Rhamnus was active, documented, attended by people who understood her function as a genuine force in their lives, not metaphorically, not as a convenient way of explaining why pride tends to precede a fall, but as an actual divine power that a daughter of night exercised over the world of mortals. The worshippers who came to Rhamnus were not asking her to harm their enemies. They were asking her to maintain the balance, to ensure that nothing went too far uncorrected, to hold the world in the shape that the distribution of things required. This is the function of a deity whose mother is night, not a power that operates in the light of orderly administration, but a power that moves through the darker structures of existence, older than the Olympian arrangement, answerable to no divine hierarchy. There is a story that the statue of Nemesis at Rhamnus was made from a block of marble that the Persian army had brought with them when they invaded Greece in 490 BCE, before the Battle of Marathon. The story holds that the Persians brought the marble to make a trophy for their expected victory. So confident were they of winning that they had already prepared the monument to their success. After Marathon, after the Athenians turned them back, the marble was taken and given to Nemesis, and the goddess was carved from the very stone the enemy had intended for their celebration. Whether or not this happened precisely as the story says, the story itself is one that the ancient tradition found worth preserving and repeating, because it says something true about what Nemesis is. She is what happens to the excessive confidence that assumes its victory before it has been earned, the corrective that answers the presumption of unearned triumph, the force that takes what pride prepared and gives it back in a different shape. The martyri appear in the tradition of Nemesis's mother as her sisters. Hesiod names them daughters of Nyx in the Theogony, the Fates who were understood to hold the structure of every mortal life between their hands. There are three of them in the form the tradition most consistently preserves. Clotho, whose name means the spinner, who draws the thread of a life from her distaff. Lachesis, the allotter, who measures out the length of it, and Atropos, the inflexible, who cuts it. Their names are not metaphors that the ancient Greeks offered as a way of describing abstract processes they did not fully understand. They were understood as figures with real agency, real function, real authority over the thing they governed. No god could override them, no prayer could reliably soften them. The hero could extend his life through remarkable deeds. He could not change the length his thread had already been measured. This is what made them appropriate as daughters of Nyx, rather than daughters of any Olympian. They operated at a level below the level of divine preference, below the level of intervention, below the level at which even Zeus exercised his will. The question of which tradition Hesiod himself held is complicated by the fact that in a different part of the Theogony, he names the Moirai as daughters of Zeus and Themis. Both traditions appear in the same text. The ancient commentators notice this. The scholiasts who annotated the Theogony in the centuries after its composition returned to this apparent contradiction and offered various readings of it, that one version was older and one more recent, that the two attributions describe different aspects of the fate's function, that the genealogy in the tradition was itself subject to revision as the theological priorities of different periods shifted. What matters for understanding the figures themselves is that both attributions survive, that they were preserved together in the same text without the sense that one was wrong and required correction, and that the older attribution, the one placing the Moirai in the household of night, reflects a layer of cosmological thinking in which the forces governing mortal life were understood to predate the Olympian order entirely. The thread was being spun before Zeus ruled. The measurement was being taken before Themis gave law to the world. The shears had always been there, held by figures whose mother was the night itself. It is worth pausing for a moment on what the Orphic tradition made of Clotho. In certain Orphic texts, the thread Clotho spins is not merely the span of a mortal life, but something more mysterious, a thread connected to the soul's particular path through the world, its passage between lives, its long journey through the cycles that the Orphic tradition understood as the structure of existence. This tradition belongs to a different layer of ancient Greek thought from the Hesiodic one, later in its textual form, though claiming to be older in its content. But even here, the figure at the loom is a daughter of night. Even in the Orphic tradition's elaborate cosmological structure, the fates remain connected to the darkness from which they were first made. The spindle turns in the dark. The thread runs through the dark. The cut, when it comes quietly. And then there is the last of the daughters to name here, the one whose act the tradition preserves with such precision that the object she introduced into the world has been described and debated and narrated for nearly 3,000 years. Eris, goddess of discord, is named by Hesiod in the Theogony as another daughter of Nyx, placed among her siblings without particular emphasis, listed in the catalogue with the same flat attention Hesiod gives to the others. She receives one line. She receives less commentary in the Theogony than several of her sisters. The tradition does not suggest, at the level of Hesiod's text, that she is more important than Nemesis or Apate or Oises. She is simply one among the children, night boar, another force released into the world from the far edge of the cosmos where her mother dwells. But Eris has a deed attached to her name that the tradition has never let go. At the wedding of Peleus, a mortal king of the Myrmidons, and Thetis, the sea nymph, a celebration was held to which the gods were invited. This was an event of considerable divine significance, the union of a mortal and an immortal, attended by the Olympians themselves. Almost all of the gods were there. Eris was not invited. The tradition is not entirely consistent about why. Some versions hold that she was excluded deliberately, because her presence at any gathering tends toward the result her name describes, and no one wanted discord at a wedding. Some versions simply note the absence without explaining it. What all versions agree on is what she did in response. She arrived anyway at the door of the celebration, and she threw into the gathering a golden apple inscribed with three Greek words, Te Kaliste, for the fairest. The apple rolled across the floor. Three goddesses reached for it: Hera, the queen of the gods; Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war; Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Each of them believed, with reasons the tradition finds entirely understandable, that the apple was meant for her. Zeus, asked to judge between them, declined. He knew something about the consequences of that judgment that the tradition suggests no one would wish to be responsible for. He sent them instead to Paris, a prince of Troy, young, handsome, judged by the ancient world to be equipped for the task in the way that certain figures are designated for particular roles, which is to say that he was chosen not because the choice was likely to go well, but because the story required someone to make it. Each goddess offered him something in exchange for the apple. Hera offered power and kingship. Athena offered wisdom and skill in war. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Paris chose Aphrodite. He took Helen. Menelaus called on every king in Greece who had sworn an oath to defend the honor of whatever man won her to wife, and the Greek fleet sailed for Troy. The war lasted 10 years in the tradition as Homer tells it. Thousands of figures from every city and island of the Greek world appear in the catalog of the Iliad, named and placed and given their fathers' names and the names of their home cities. The full catalog of a civilization mobilized. Cities were destroyed. Heroes died. The gods divided between the Greek cause and the Trojan one, and the divisions among the divine factions produced consequences that ran through every battle and every negotiation and every moment of the siege. Achilles withdrew from the fighting and returned, and what his return cost him the Iliad makes its central subject. Hector was killed. Patroclus was killed before him. Agamemnon was killed on his return home by his wife, in a story that then required Orestes to avenge his father and Clytemnestra to be killed by her son, and the chain of consequence extended outward through 3 generations of tragedy, through the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, through more narrative and more suffering and more consequence than any single account can fully contain. Troy burned, and a daughter of night threw an apple at a wedding. This is how the tradition holds it, not as metaphor, not as a way of saying that discord is dangerous or that excluded parties tend to find ways of making their absence felt. The tradition holds it as a sequence of actual events in mythological time, each one following from the last: the apple at the beginning, and the burning city at the end, and Eris, the daughter of night, standing at the door of a celebration she was not invited to, holding the thing she brought. What this says about how the ancient Greeks understood causation, and what they understood about the nature of forces like discord, is something the tradition does not spell out as a lesson. It simply holds the sequence, from the goddess at the door, to the fleet in the water, to the fire on the walls of Troy, the whole length of it, and lets the length itself say what it says. The cave of Hypnos near the Lethe, the twin figures of sleep and peaceful death on the painted vases, the dream that moves through a sleeping king's mind, wearing the face of someone he trusts, the daughter of night who ensures that no pride goes unanswered, the 3 who hold the thread and the measure and the shears, the golden apple on the floor at the wedding. All of these belong to one household. They came from the same source, from the far edge of the cosmos, where night makes her dwelling in the tradition, as Hesiod describes it, and they were sent out from there into the world, sleep every night, death when its time comes. The dreams that arrive in the dark hours carrying their cargo of truth or deception, the corrective force that moves through the world, adjusting what has grown too far in one direction, the structure of beginning and end that no mortal life escapes, the discord that enters through the door of a celebration and sets in motion more consequence than anyone in the room could have calculated. The ancient Greek tradition did not find it strange that all of these should come from night. In a cosmological system where light was born from darkness, where aether and hemera, brightness and day, emerged from the union of Nyx and Erebus, darkness and dark together, producing the conditions for illumination, it was entirely consistent that the forces governing so much of mortal experience should trace their origin to the same source. Night was not the absence of the day. Night was what the day came from. And what the night produced was not only darkness, but everything that operated in darkness, everything that worked through the hours of sleep and the hours of the unseen, everything that ran beneath the surface of the daylit world, doing the work that daylit work could not do. There is a particular quality to this household, to the catalogue of night's children, as Hesiod assembles it in the Theogony. The list does not build to a dramatic conclusion. It does not arrange its figures in order of importance, with the most significant saved for the end. Hypnos and Thanatos appear early. Nemesis and Eris appear later. The Moirai are placed among the others with the same cataloging attention Hesiod gives to everyone. What the list produces, read as a whole, is less an argument and more a map of the forces that the ancient Greek world recognized as operating beyond the reach of Olympian administration, not because they were rebellious or transgressive, but because they were older, because they had been doing what they did before the Olympian order existed, and would continue doing it on the same terms. Sleep arrives every night. Death comes for every mortal life. Dreams continue to move through sleeping minds, carrying whatever they carry. The corrective force continues to notice excess. The thread continues to be spun. Discord continues to find the celebration where it was not invited. The poppies at the entrance to the cave are still there, in the tradition, still growing in that particular mythological space, at the edge of the world near the river of forgetting. The same poppies that have always been there, thick-stemmed, their blooms hanging slightly. Inside, the silence continues to have the quality the ancient sources describe, complete, particular, belonging entirely to night, belonging to the household of the oldest goddess in the Greek understanding of what the world is. The blooms hang, the river runs slowly past, and somewhere in the deep interior of the cave, past the silence and the sound of water, Hypnos rests in the way that sleep itself rests between the times it is needed. Patient, unhurried, waiting, his mother sent him there. His mother sent all of them out into the world, the whole household of forces that operate through the dark and through the dream and through the long corrective patience of night. And from somewhere far at the edge of the cosmos, she continues to do what she has always done, spreading her star-sown robe across the sky at the close of each day, the stars appearing one by one in the fabric overhead, and everything that belongs to night moving out again into the world. The apple the daughter of night threw at a wedding was small. The tradition describes it as golden, which is to say, it caught the light, which is to say, it was visible from across the room the moment it entered. Every god in the room went still. 3 of them reached for it, and everything that followed from the reaching, the judgment and the choice and the fleet and the fire, all of it began in her household, in the household of night, which is also the household of sleep and death and dreams and the thread that measures every life, A household older than the world, it filled with its children, still sending them out each evening, still tending the cave where the poppies grow, and the Lethe runs quietly past in the dark. At the moment a life begins, in the understanding that Hesiod's catalog preserves, something else begins with it. Not a figure who will arrive later, not a force that gathers at the threshold of old age or waits at the end of long illness. Something that is present from the first breath, inseparable from the life it belongs to, already there in the way a shadow is already cast, the moment a light is lit. The ancient Greeks called this moros, and what the tradition holds about him is not that he comes for the living, but that he has always already come, that the end point of every mortal life exists not as a future event approaching from a distance, but as a condition of existence, woven into the fabric of what a mortal person is, from the moment they are born. Hesiod names Moros among the very first children born to Nyx alone, without a father, in the opening section of his long catalogue of her offspring in the Theogony. The list is assembled with a steady, patient hand, name following name, each representing some quality or condition of mortal life. Moros stands near the beginning of that list. He has no myth attached to him, no episode in which he acts, no moment where a hero encounters him on a road or at a crossroads and must make a bargain or pass some test. He simply exists in the catalogue, named and set down, and the meaning of his name, doom, individual destiny, the appointed end, is enough to carry the full weight of what Hesiod intended. The tradition did not need to narrate him. His presence in the list was itself the statement. What Moros represents is something the ancient Greeks thought about with considerable care. The question of whether the end of a mortal life was fixed or fluid, whether the gods could alter it, or whether even they were bound by what had been appointed, runs through much of the oldest Greek poetry. In the Iliad, Zeus looks down at the battlefield and sees his mortal son Sarpedon about to be killed, and the text pauses on his grief and his consideration of whether to intervene, whether divine love could overrule what had been set. The tradition holds that it could not. Other gods speak plainly about this. The thread of a life, the appointed end, the doom that cannot be lifted, these are not poetic flourishes in the Greek sources, but genuine theological claims about the structure of existence. And in Hesiod's cosmogony, the origin of that structure is located not in Olympus and not in the decisions of any Olympian god, but in the household of Night. Moros is her child. The appointed end is something she made. This does not mean, in the tradition's understanding, that Nyx herself determines when each life ends, or that she has knowledge of every individual doom. The catalogue is not a story about a goddess exercising power over individual mortals. It is something quieter, and in some ways more fundamental, a way of saying that doom, as a condition of mortal existence, belongs to the original fabric of the world, to the generation of beings that preceded the Olympian order and will persist beyond it. Moros is not a weapon in anyone's hand. He is a feature of reality, like darkness itself, or the fact that day must end. From Moros, the catalogue moves on, and the register of what Nyx produced shifts in a way that even Hesiod's plain, enumerative style cannot quite contain. Also listed in the Theogony as daughters born to Nyx are the Charis, dark female spirits of violent death, distinguishable from Thanatos by everything the ancient sources record about them. Where Thanatos carries an inverted torch and appears in vase painting as a winged youth, composed and serene, the Charis are described in the tradition as something altogether different. Homer's Iliad places them on the battlefield, moving through the aftermath of fighting, and the language the text reaches for is not the language of peaceful passage. They are described as black-robed, pale-faced, with claws and fanged mouths, hovering over the fallen, dragging away the souls of those who have died by violence, feeding on blood. The contrast with Thanatos is held consistently across the ancient sources, and it is not incidental. The Greeks were distinguishing between two different qualities of death, the gentle and inevitable end of a life completed, which Thanatos represented, and the violent, untimely, blood-soaked death of a battlefield, which the Keres embodied. Both were daughters of night. Both were present in the world as conditions of mortal existence. The tradition does not rank them or suggest that one represents a failure of the cosmic order while the other represents its proper operation. Violent death was part of the world Hesiod was describing, and the Keres were its personified reality, not punishment, not accident, not the consequence of any particular failure of divine governance, but children of night, like everything else in the catalogue, occupying their place in the original fabric of existence, alongside doom and sleep and the gentler end that Thanatos carried. On the battlefield of Troy, as Homer depicts it, the Keres move without dramatic announcement. They are simply present in the way that violent death is present, wherever fighting goes on for long enough. The black robes and pale faces are described without commentary, without the narrator of the Iliad pausing to remark on what the Keres mean or why they are there. They appear, they take what they have come for, and the text moves on. This is consistent with how the oldest Greek sources treat the darkest offspring of Nyx, not as spectacles requiring explanation, but as features of a world the tradition understood clearly and described plainly, without the need to justify or apologize for what it saw. Alongside Moros and the Keres, in the same passage of the Theogony, Hesiod names Oises. Her name means misery, and the etymology carries forward in a direct line to the English word derived from it. What she represents is not acute suffering, not the sharp grief that follows a specific loss, but something more diffuse and more persistent, the anxiety and weight and accumulative burden of a life lived under mortal conditions, the psychological texture of suffering that is not the result of any particular event, but is simply the ground of mortal experience. She was, in the tradition, the personification of that ground. Oises received almost no independent cult worship. There is no temple to her in Pausanias, no festival calendar that included her, no record of sacrificial rituals directed specifically toward her. She stands in the catalogue without a sanctuary, without worshippers making specific requests, without any institutional presence in the religious life of ancient Greece. And in a way, this absence is itself a form of acknowledgement. The tradition was not placing Oises among the gods who could be appealed to, who could be asked to withhold what they carried, or to grant what was in their gift. She is in the list because suffering required no cause and no agent in the ancient Greek understanding. It was not sent by a god who could be propitiated, not the result of sin or impurity that a ritual could correct, but a condition as fundamental as darkness, as inseparable from mortal existence, as the doom that Moros represented. Her place in the catalogue is the acknowledgement itself. This is one of the things that distinguishes the Hesiodic treatment of Nyx's darker offspring from other ways a tradition might handle such material. There is no story in which Oises was created as a consequence of some original act, no moment in a narrative where the world was ordered so that suffering entered it through a particular door. In the Theogony, Oises is simply there at the beginning, born tonight before the cosmos had its present shape, listed among the original conditions of existence, with the same steady hand that lists everything else. The ancient Greeks were not offering an explanation of why suffering exists. They were recording that it does, and placing it where it belonged, in the household of night, in the first generation of things that are. In the same catalog, in the verse that follows nearby, Hesiod names Apate. She is the personification not of any particular lie or act of deception, but of the cosmic principle of falseness itself, the capacity for reality to appear other than it is, for what seems true to diverge from what is. In Greek thought, this was considered among the most disorienting of forces, the one that made the others harder to navigate, because without the reliability of appearance, every other experience becomes uncertain. The gods themselves deceived one another, and mortals with considerable frequency in the older myths, but what Apate represents is not the habit of deception as a strategy. It is the fact of it as a condition, the original possibility built into the world that things can seem other than they are. Among Nyx's children, Apate occupies a quiet but significant place, the capacity for reality to mislead, for a face to hide another face, for words to carry meanings other than the ones they appear to carry, for the true condition of a thing to be entirely concealed by its surface, was, in the ancient Greek understanding, not a late addition to the world, not something introduced by any specific act of divine mischief or mortal transgression. It was primordial, it was born from night, whatever it was that made the world susceptible to falseness, that made deception possible at the level of reality itself, and not merely at the level of individual intentions. That quality was older than the Olympian gods, older than the ordering of the cosmos, as old as the darkness from which everything emerged. The ancient sources that preserve these catalogs do not spend much time explaining what follows from this. They record the genealogy and move on, but the implication is present in the arrangement itself, that an account of the world which left out doom, violent death, misery, and the capacity for falseness would be an incomplete account, would be describing a world that does not exist. The Greeks were composing cosmologies that could hold the full weight of mortal experience, including the parts of that experience that could not be improved or appealed away, and the place they located those parts was in the original household of night, as close to the beginning of things as it was possible to place them. From Apate, the catalog continues, and there is one entry that carries more theological weight than almost anything else in the list. In the Theogony, at lines 217 and 218, Hesiod names among the daughters of Nyx the Morai the three fates. He calls them Clo, she who spins the thread of each mortal life, Lachesis, she who measures its length, and Atropos, she who cannot be turned, who holds the shears. These three figures were among the most widely recognized in ancient Greek religion. Their work was the work of fate itself. The thread that Clotho drew from her spindle was the life of a mortal. The measure that Lachesis set was the span of that life, its length, the amount allotted to each person. And Atropos held what the tradition considered the most decisive power of the three, the shears that cut the thread, the act that could not be undone, the moment of death that her name insisted could not be redirected or appealed by any force in the universe. In many accounts of Greek religion, the Moirai are connected to Zeus and to the divine order he maintains. In the Iliad, Zeus appears at times to be weighing the fates of mortals in his golden scales, and the later traditions sometimes treated fate as something that the king of the gods administered, or at least observed with foreknowledge. But in Hesiod's Theogony, in this particular attribution, the Moirai daughters of Nyx, born to night alone, without a father, in the same generation as Morus, and the Caries and Oises and Apate, This is not the Moiraphri as instruments of a divine order centered on Olympus. This is the Moiraphri as something older than that order, something that precedes it and cannot be subject to it, belonging to the primordial household, whose authority operated on a different plane than anything the Olympians represented. The tension with other accounts was visible to ancient readers, and it was not resolved. Hesiod himself, in another passage of the Theogony, names the Moirai among the daughters of Zeus and Themis, the goddess of divine law and order. The two attributions sit within the same text, in different passages, and the tradition preserved both without choosing between them. Ancient scholars and commentators noticed this and wrote about it. The scholiasts who annotated the manuscripts of Hesiod and Homer returned to this question across generations, recognizing that it was not a simple error to be corrected, but a preservation of two different layers of Greek cosmological thinking, an older layer and a newer one, each carrying its own theological meaning. The tract, the older layer, says this: the Fates are daughters of night, the force that governs the length of every mortal life, that spins its thread and measures it and cuts it, operates from the same household as doom and violent death and misery and deceit. Fate is not a function of the Olympian order. It is not something Zeus administers. It is something that predates him, something he inherits rather than commands, something that was in the world before the world had its present shape. The newer layer says something different, that fate is woven into the fabric of divine law, that it belongs to the same structure as justice and order, that Zeus stands at the center of its operation. Both layers were considered worth preserving. Neither was allowed to erase the other. What survives in the text is both layers together, sitting in proximity, the contradiction held open rather than resolved. And this is itself an act of preservation of considerable significance. The scribes who copied the Theogony across the centuries were transmitting not a tidy cosmological system, but a record of how the tradition actually thought, which was not always tidily and not always in a single voice. The oldest attributions remembered that fate was something night made. The later tradition wanted fate to sit closer to Zeus, to be part of the ordered world he maintained. Both memories were kept. Both are still there in the text. Three figures with a spindle, a measuring rod, and shears, working in the dark of a domain older than Olympus. The thread running between their hands is the life of every mortal who has ever lived or will ever live, drawn out, measured, cut. No prayer changes the measure. No sacrifice redirects the shears. What Atropos has decided is done, and the tradition is insistent on this point. The name itself is the insistence. She who cannot be turned, not she who is unlikely to be turned, or she who has not yet been turned. She who cannot be. This is why the placement of the Moirai in Nyx's household matters so much in the oldest layer of the tradition. The Fates at Olympus, as daughters of Zeus, are still awesome and irreversible, but they exist within a framework that is at least notionally ordered, at least notionally governed by the principles that Zeus and Themis represent. The Fates as daughters of night are something else. They are fate before it was domesticated into divine law, fate as a primordial condition of existence, as original as darkness, as indifferent to the Olympian order, as the darkness itself is indifferent to whatever the gods on Olympus decide to do. This older understanding casts the rest of Nyx's catalog in a particular light. When Morris is placed at the beginning of the list, the individual doom that attaches to every life from birth, and the Moirai appear later in the same list, the spinners and measurers and cutters of the thread, there is a coherence to the household that Nyx rules. Doom and fate are not different forces pulling in different directions. They are part of the same original structure of mortal existence, both born from the same mother, both older than the order that Olympus represents, both indifferent to any appeal. What a mortal life is, in this understanding, is a thread held between three pairs of hands in the dark, spun from a beginning that was always already appointed to end. Beyond the Moirai, the catalog continues to add names, each carrying its own small weight. Hesiod is thorough in a way that becomes its own kind of rhythm, the list building not toward a climax, but toward a completeness, an account of all the conditions of mortal existence that require naming, all the forces that move through human life, whose origin the tradition held was located in the original darkness. The household of Nyx is not assembled according to what is pleasant or what a worshipper might want to acknowledge. It is assembled according to what is true, in the tradition's understanding, what is actually present in the world, what actually governs or afflicts or ends the lives of mortals, what cannot be removed by Olympian decree because it predates that decree and will outlast it. There is a stillness in the way Hesiod writes the catalog that the rhythm of his hexameters supports. Each name, each brief description, each relationship noted and set down carries the same weight in the verse, receives the same metrical attention. Doom and violent death, and misery and deceit and fate are not sensationalized in the text. They are cataloged, and cataloging, in this tradition, is itself a form of recognition, an acknowledgement that these things exist, that they have been given names, that the names have been set down in verse, so that the names persist, so that what they represent is held in the record of what the world is made from. This is the particular quality of the Hesiodic catalog. As a form, its insistence on completeness over comfort, its willingness to set down the full range of what exists, rather than the range that would be reassuring. The theogony is not a consolation, it is a record, and the record holds that among the original conditions of existence, born tonight before the cosmos had its present form, are doom and violent death, and misery and deceit, and fate. These are not aberrations in the structure of the world, and they are original features of it, as fundamental and as permanent as the darkness from which everything emerged. To sit with this, as the ancient Greeks did, required a particular kind of attention, not the attention that looks for consolation, not the attention that expects the record to arrive at a final reassurance, but the attention that can hold difficult facts about existence without looking away from them and without being overwhelmed by them. The tone of the catalog itself models this attention. Hesiod writes Moros, and the Keres and Oises, and Apate, and the Moirai, with the same unhurried cataloging voice he uses for everything else. The list does not accelerate. The verse does not shift register. The darker offspring of Nyx receive the same measured, careful treatment as the lighter ones. This is, in a way, the theological claim encoded in the form. The darkness from which all things emerged made everything, sleep and death, dreams and doom, gentle ending and violent ending, the capacity for falseness and the inescapability of fate, and the appropriate response to the full range of what was made is not to single out the difficult parts for special alarm or special grief, but to note them with the same attention one brings to everything else, to place them in the record, to speak their names clearly, and to understand that they are as old as the darkness, as permanent as night herself, as inseparable from the world as the mother who made them. The Moirai at their work, then, in the oldest layer of the tradition. 3 figures in the dark, the spindle turning, the thread running between their hands, the thread of every mortal life that has ever been spun out and measured and cut in the long time since Nyx first set them to their work. The domain they occupy is described in the oldest sources as older than Olympus, as located in or near the dwelling of night at the extreme edge of the cosmos, at the threshold where the world runs out. The same threshold described elsewhere in the tradition, where night herself moves at the close of each day, where her house stands at the junction of underworld and sky. In that oldest understanding, fate is not a divine administrator sitting in a hall of justice and reviewing the particulars of each mortal case. It is something done in the dark, at the edge of the world, by daughters of night, their hands steady on the thread, their attention neither kind nor cruel, but simply present, the way night herself is present, the way darkness is present, everywhere and always, without preference, without exception. The thread comes off the spindle, the measure is set, the shears close. And in the oldest layer of the Greek tradition, this happens not in Olympus, and not by Zeus's decree, but in the household of the darkness, where the night sky has always been, carrying its stars across the heavens at the close of each day, ancient and unhurried and unmoved. Whatever came after in the tradition, the later attributions, the scholiasts arguing across generations about how to reconcile the two Hesiodic passages, the theologians trying to bring the fates into closer alignment with the Olympian order, the oldest layer remembered. The Moirai were daughters of night. Fate was something darkness made before any other order existed, and it persisted through every ordering of the cosmos that followed, unchanged, unchangeable, belonging to no system that could be revised or reformed, belonging only to the household at the edge of the world where night dwells, and the thread turns, and the shears wait at the end of every life that was ever spun into existence. The spindle turns in the dark. The thread is drawn out, thin and continuous, running between the hands of figures who need no light to do their work, who have been doing it since before light existed, who will do it until the last thread is cut and the spindle holds nothing more. This is what Hesiod's catalog preserves, in its oldest layer, stripped of the later additions and the attempts at reconciliation, a record of what night made in the beginning before the world had its present form, when the darkness was everything, and the daughters of that darkness were setting to work on the fabric of all the lives that would follow. Even fate was something night made. At Megara, on the northeastern edge of the Attic Peninsula, there was a precinct of Nyx. Pausanias, the Greek travel writer of the 2nd century of the Common Era, records it plainly in his description of Greece, an oracle, a dedicated space, a place where the night goddess held some kind of presence, recognized in stone and ritual, and the ongoing attention of worshippers. The precinct sat within a city that was already old when Pausanias walked through it, and he notes its existence without ceremony, the way a careful traveler notes a temple or a fountain or any other feature of a landscape shaped by long use. There was an oracle of Nyx at Megara. The sentence is short, the fact behind it is not. To stand at such a precinct, stone underfoot, the particular darkness of a Mediterranean night overhead, the kind of darkness that has weight and texture and is not simply the absence of day, would have been to arrive at a place understood as belonging to one of the oldest powers in the Greek theological world, not a goddess who had been given a domain by the Olympians, not a figure whose authority derived from Zeus's pleasure or Hera's sanction, a power whose place in the structure of things preceded the Olympians entirely, whose dwelling in the ancient sources sits at the outermost edge of the cosmos, whose children include sleep and death and the fates themselves. And here, in a city on the Greek mainland, there was a space set aside where people came to ask her something, where the darkness presumably answered. The oracle Pausanias records is not elaborated in any surviving source with great detail. What he gives is the fact of its existence, the name, the location, the implied practice of consultation. That brevity is itself worth sitting with for a moment. Pausanias was a meticulous traveler who wrote about what he found because he found it genuinely worth writing about, and he preserves dozens of oracular traditions, sacred sites, and cult locations throughout his journey through Greece. The Oracle of Nyx at Megara earns its entry in his text not because it was unusual to him, but because it was there, documented by someone who walked past it and thought it worth a line, which means that at some point in the centuries before Pausanias arrived, enough people cared about consulting Nyx in that particular place that a precinct was established, maintained, and still standing in recognizable form when a second-century traveler came through and noted it down. What those people asked the oracle, what form the answers took, what rituals surrounded the consultation, the written record does not say. What it preserves is the shape of the practice, a dedicated space, a goddess, a tradition of seeking something from the darkness at night, and the persistence of that space long enough to appear in the notes of a man writing in the 2nd century. That persistence is its own kind of testimony. Things that stop being useful are generally not maintained. There is a hymn that was addressed to Nyx directly, the Orphic Hymns, a collection of 87 hexameter hymns in Greek, composed somewhere in the long span between the 2nd century BCE and the 2nd century of the Common Era, include as their third entry a hymn to the night goddess alone. The collection is called Orphic because the compositions claim association with the theological tradition attributed in antiquity to Orpheus, the mythological singer, though the hymns are almost certainly much later than any single author, and represent instead a tradition of ritual poetry developed over several centuries. The third hymn opens with an address. Nyx is called Mother of Gods and Men. She is described as night-ruling. She is addressed with the epithet all-taming, a word that, in its Greek form, carries the sense of something that cannot be resisted, that eventually draws everything under its influence, the way sleep eventually claims, even those who intend to remain awake. The hymn asks her for two specific things. It asks her to grant restful sleep, and it asks her to drive away nightmares. These are not abstract theological requests. They are the practical requests of someone lying down in the dark at the end of a day, hoping for something that does not always come on its own. The hymn was composed to be used, to be spoken aloud, presumably at night, presumably by someone who genuinely wanted the night goddess to take notice and extend something like favor. The person who wrote it had thought carefully about what to call her and what to ask for, and the tradition preserved it long enough to be copied and recopied and eventually published in the modern era, where scholars read it and translate it and note that it addresses Nyx as Mother of Gods and Men, which is an enormous thing to say about any figure in the Greek theological world. In the broader Greek tradition, the gods most commonly addressed as parent or ancestor of the gods and of humanity are figures like Zeus or Cronus, or occasionally the Titans in their generative capacity. To address Nyx as Mother of Gods and Men is to position her as something even more foundational, not a ruler of the gods, but their origin point, the condition out of which everything else emerged. The hymn does not argue this position. It simply states it, as a given, in the opening address, the way any hymn states what it considers obvious about its subject before moving to the request. The tradition that produced the hymn had already decided this was how Nyx was to be understood, and the hymn opens from that understanding as its starting point. A worshipper speaking the hymn aloud in the dark would have been doing something specific and documented, invoking the oldest power in the Greek cosmological world, using her oldest titles, and asking for the most ordinary human gift, a night without bad dreams, and with good sleep at the end of it. The scale of the addressee and the modesty of the request sit together without any apparent tension. In the ancient tradition, this was simply what you did when you wanted something from the powers that governed the night. You addressed them with their full weight, and you asked for what you needed. The Orphic tradition preserved something else about Nyx that is different in kind from Hesiod's presentation of her, something that moves her from cosmological figure to oracular voice. In the fragmentary theological writings associated with Orphic thought, Nyx is sometimes the one who speaks first, who gives instruction, guidance, and prophetic knowledge to the creator figure before the ordering of the cosmos has properly begun. In this tradition, night is not simply the primordial condition out of which things emerged. She is the one who knows what should come next, and who communicates that knowledge to those capable of receiving it. The most significant physical evidence for this tradition is a document called the Derveni Papyrus. It was recovered from a burial site in northern Greece, near the city of Thessaloniki, discovered in 1962 in the context of an ancient cremation grave. The papyrus had been partially burned, placed on the funeral pyre, most scholars believe, as part of the burial ritual, and what survives is a charred, damaged, fragile document that nonetheless remains legible enough to be read and studied. It is the oldest surviving Greek literary manuscript, dated on physical and textual grounds to approximately the 4th century BCE, though the text it copies appears to be older still. It is a prose commentary on an Orphic poem about cosmogony, about how the world came to be in its ordered form, and within its damaged columns, in the surviving sections of text, Nyx appears in a role unlike anything Hesiod assigns her. In the tradition the Derveni Papyrus preserves, Nyx gives oracular responses to the creator figure. She speaks from her position at the outer edge of the ordered world, or from the position she occupies before that world is ordered at all, and what she speaks is guidance about what must happen next, what must be done in what sequence for the cosmos to take its proper shape. She is, in this tradition, not simply the first night, but the first voice of divine counsel, the one who, in the darkness before anything had fully settled into its form, knew what the form should be. This is a different kind of authority from the one Hesiod describes. Hesiod's Nyx is ancient, and her authority is structural. She exists before everything. She gave birth to forces that shaped human experience, and even Zeus does not antagonize her. But she does not speak much in Hesiod. She is primarily a presence, a condition, a dwelling at the edge of everything. The Orphic tradition preserves a version of Nyx, who speaks, who instructs, who transmits knowledge across the boundary that her own nature defines, the boundary between the darkness before the world and the world itself. The Derveni Papyrus is damaged enough that significant portions of the text are fragmentary or missing entirely. Scholars read it carefully and cautiously, noting where interpretations are certain and where they are provisional. But what survives is enough to establish that the tradition it records assigned Nyx a cosmological role that placed her at the moment of divine instruction, the moment when the Creator received the knowledge needed to proceed, and that this role was considered important enough to write down, and important enough that someone placed the document in a grave rather than discarding it, and important enough that the document survived in that grave for more than 2,000 years before anyone found it. The papyrus now rests in the Archaeological Museum of Thessaloniki in northern Greece. It is preserved in sections, the the damaged portions consolidated and protected, the legible text available for scholars to study and debate. It carries inside its scorched and partial columns a tradition of thought about the night and what it knows that is different from anything in the mainstream literary record, not because it contradicts the mainstream record, but because it occupies a different register of theological concern, one that was associated with mystery traditions and initiatory practice rather than the public literary culture that produced the Homeric epics and Hesiod's genealogies. To read the Derveni papyrus, even in translation, even in the fragmented and partially reconstructed form in which it survives, is to encounter a tradition that had decided something specific about the relationship between darkness and knowledge. Not that darkness conceals knowledge, that is the ordinary intuition, the sense that what we cannot see is hidden from us, but that darkness, in its oldest and most essential form, is itself the source of a certain kind of knowing. That Nyx, the goddess who embodies the night, not as a temporary condition, but as a permanent structural reality of the cosmos, is the appropriate figure to consult when knowledge about origins is what is needed. She was there at the beginning. She knows what the beginning was. The practices associated with Nyx and her divine household in ancient Greece were distinguished from the worship of the Olympian gods, not just by their subject matter, but by the specific forms they took. In the religious calendar of ancient Greece, the Olympians received their major worship in the daytime, sacrifices at open altars under the sky, animals that were white or pale colored, the blood and smoke rising upward in the direction of the divine dwelling on Olympus. This is a generalization, and ancient Greek religious practice was enormously varied across regions and periods, but the broad pattern holds. The sky gods received sky-facing, daylight worship, and the offerings appropriate to them pointed upward. The powers associated with the earth, the underworld, and the primordial darkness received a different ritual register. Offerings were made at night. The animals chosen for sacrifice were dark-colored, black sheep, black bulls, the color of the night sky, and the color of the underworld as ancient thought imagined it. The offerings were directed downward rather than upward, poured into pits or trenches rather than burned on altars, in ways that sent smoke skyward. These distinctions were not decorative. They were functional, a way of marking that the powers being addressed belonged to a different layer of the divine world, one that predated and in some respects lay beneath the Olympian order rather than within it. Nyx and her household sat within this older register. The children she had given to the world, sleep and death, the dream spirits, the forces of doom and fate, and misery and retribution, were not figures invited to the bright feasts on Olympus. They had their own dwelling, at the far edge of the cosmos, in the territory the Theogony describes as neither fully above nor fully below, a place where the underworld and the sky touch at their outermost limits. Propitiation of these powers, when it occurred, followed the older ritual forms. Nighttime, dark animals, downward directed offerings, the whole apparatus of a religious practice that distinguished between the world as it had been ordered by the Olympians and the world as it had been before that ordering began. This ritual distinction is not a sign of fear, precisely. It is a sign of careful attention. The ancient Greeks who designed and maintained these practices were distinguishing between types of divine power and addressing each type in the manner appropriate to it. To offer a white bull to Nyx would not have been humble worship. It would have been a category error, the wrong form applied to the wrong power, like addressing a letter to the wrong house. The black animals offered at night to the primordial gods were the right form, understood within a system that took the differences between divine powers seriously enough to mark them in the ritual itself. There is something in this that speaks to how the ancient Greeks understood Nyx's position in the theological world. She was not worshipped in the same way as Athena or Aphrodite or Apollo. She did not have their temples in every city, their festivals in every seasonal calendar, their statues in every public square. Her cult was smaller, more specialized, more associated with particular kinds of religious need, but it was real. The oracle at Megara was real. The hymn composed for her was real. The ritual practices that addressed the primordial powers through dark offerings at night were real, and all of it pointed toward a recognition that had been present in Greek thought from the oldest sources that there is a layer of the divine world that is older than the gods most people pray to most of the time, and that this older layer is not irrelevant or safely ignorable, but present and active in the fabric of every night. Incubation was another practice that rested implicitly on this understanding. The practice of sleeping within a sacred precinct to receive a divine dream was widespread in ancient Greece, most famously associated with healing sanctuaries of Asclepius, where the sick slept within the temple grounds, hoping to receive in dreams the diagnosis or cure that waking medicine had not provided. But the logic of incubation extended across the religious world in various forms, wherever the dream was understood as a channel of divine communication, rather than simply a byproduct of sleep. To go to sleep in a sacred space, in the expectation that the night would bring something across the boundary between the divine world and the waking one, was to act on the assumption that the night itself was governed by divine powers capable of and willing to make that communication happen. In this sense, every incubation practice in ancient Greece was implicitly an acknowledgement of Nyx's domain. Not always hers specifically, the dream was often attributed to a local deity, or to Hypnos, or to the specific god of the sanctuary, but the structure of the practice rested on the primordial authority she held. Night was the medium through which divine dreams traveled. Night was the condition in which the sleeping mortal became, temporarily, accessible to powers that could not reach them in the ordinary noise and activity of the waking day. And the night, in the Greek understanding that ran from Hesiod through the Orphic hymns to Pausanias and beyond, was Nyx's domain in a way that was not merely poetic or metaphorical, but structural, part of the cosmological architecture of the world. A worshipper lying down within a sanctuary precinct at night, arranging themselves on the ground or on a simple pallet, waiting in the darkness for something to come. That person was doing something that the theological tradition around them understood in specific terms. The night was not simply a neutral backdrop. It was a presence with its own governance, its own powers, its own household of forces that moved through it. To sleep in the dark and wait for a dream was to enter a territory that had its own ruler, and the ruler was old enough and powerful enough that even the king of the gods, in one documented and well-preserved episode of ancient literature, declined to disturb her. The Orphic hymn to Nyx was composed to be used in ritual. This is the scholarly consensus, that the Orphic hymns were not literary compositions intended for reading, but working texts intended for ceremony, probably associated with Dionysiac or mystery cult practices in the later centuries of the ancient world. The hymns were spoken aloud. They were accompanied. The introductory notes to many of them indicate, by specific offerings. The text of each hymn often includes a note on what kind of incense was appropriate to its deity, or what kind of sacrifice. The hymn to Nyx herself specifies that it was accompanied by torches, which is a detail worth holding. torches rather than a burning altar, light carried in the hand rather than light fixed in a public place, a deliberate portable illumination in the context of a power whose domain was the absence of sunlight, someone standing in the dark, holding a torch, speaking to the goddess of night. This is a documented ritual form. The person doing it was not performing it as a symbol or an aesthetic experience. They were doing it because the tradition they had inherited told them this was the appropriate way to address one of the oldest divine powers in the world they lived in. The words they spoke had been composed carefully for the purpose. The epithets, night ruling, all taming, mother of gods and men, had been chosen to accurately characterize the deity being addressed, to demonstrate to her that the worshipper knew who she was and was addressing her with appropriate knowledge. The requests, restful sleep, freedom from nightmares, were modest by the scale of what was being invoked, but they were genuine. The person who composed the hymn was asking for real things, from a real power, with a real expectation that the address might matter, that the hymn survived across centuries of manuscript transmission, was included in editions of the Orphic texts that circulated in the Byzantine period and eventually into the modern era, and is now translated into dozens of languages and read by scholars, classicists, and generally curious people around the world. This is not something the original composers would have anticipated or planned for. They composed a working ritual text. What they produced, inadvertently, was also a document that would carry Nyx's name and titles and the form of her worship forward across a span of time, long enough to make the span itself almost impossible to think about clearly. The tradition of Nyx in ancient Greek thought is not uniform, and this is worth acknowledging plainly. Hesiod's account and the Orphic tradition are not identical. They share a recognition of her primordial seniority, her position before the Olympian order, and her role as the source of forces that shape human experience. But they differ in emphasis, in the specific powers they assign her, and in the degree to which they make her an active figure rather than a structural one. Hesiod's Nyx is primarily a genealogical anchor, the origin point of a household of forces, the figure whose antiquity is the deepest anchor of the system. The Orphic Nyx is something more explicitly active, a figure who speaks and instructs, and whose knowledge of the night before the world took shape is a form of wisdom that can be consulted. Both traditions existed in antiquity. Both found worshippers and readers and interpreters. Both survived, in different forms and through different channels, into the texts that modern readers and scholars work with now. The Oracle of Nyx at Megara is consistent with the Orphic understanding of her as a figure whose knowledge could be consulted. You do not establish a working oracle for a deity whose only role is genealogical. The Hesiodic tradition of her as the oldest structure of the cosmos is consistent with the ritual distinction that set her worship apart from the Olympian calendar. You address the oldest things differently from the things that came later. Both pictures are partial. Together they give a sense of something that was understood in antiquity to be genuinely significant, genuinely old, and genuinely worthy of careful attention. The Derveni papyrus, lying in its burial site in northern Greece before the 1962 excavation brought it to the surface, had been there for something like 2,300 years. The soil above it had been walked over countless times. Cities had changed their names and been built and rebuilt. Empires had come and gone. Languages that did not exist when the papyrus was placed in the ground had become the native tongues of millions of people, some of whom had eventually learned enough ancient Greek to read the text inside it. The papyrus had not known about any of this. It was simply there, in the dark, in the ground, holding its text. When the excavators found it and understood what they had found, and when the text was eventually cleaned and read and studied and published, what it contained was a piece of the theological tradition of a world that had ended roughly 15 centuries earlier. The Orphic cosmogony recorded in its columns, the oracular role of Nyx, the elaborate structure of thought about what existed before the world took its ordered form, all of it had been sitting in the dark, intact enough to be recovered, waiting without impatience for someone to find it. This is the nature of the kind of survival that the ancient sources document. They were not preserved because anyone planned their preservation across 2 millennia. They were preserved through the accumulation of small local decisions, a copyist choosing to reproduce a text, a monastery maintaining a library, a grave sealed carefully enough to protect a fragile scroll, an excavator noticing something in the soil, the thread connecting the ancient Greek worshipper who spoke hymn 3 to Nyx by torchlight to the modern scholar who publishes a critical edition of the Orphic hymns is not planned continuity. It is accumulated accident, the survival of fragile things through circumstances that easily could have gone differently. And yet here the texts are. Here is Pausanias's note about the oracle at Megara. Here is the hymn with its titles and its requests and its specification of torches. Here is the Derveni papyrus with its damaged columns and the traces inside them of a tradition in which Nyx spoke first. In the darkness, before anything else had been ordered, here are the records of black animals offered at night, the ritual register of a religious practice that marked the primordial powers as belonging to a different layer of the divine world. These things survived. They are readable. They continue to carry, forward in time, the understanding that a power called night was considered by the ancient Greeks to be one of the oldest and most fundamental conditions of existence, not an absence, not a negative state, not merely the gap between one day and the next, but something with its own presence and its own governance and its own children and its own oracles and its own hymns. The oracle at Megara eventually closed, as oracles close. The practice of Orphic ritual eventually faded, as practices fade when the communities that sustain them disperse. The incubation sanctuaries fell into ruin or were converted to other uses,